Hi everyone, welcome to Startupification, a podcast about how technology is changing the world around us with me, Matt Ferrugia, and my co-host, Stephen Drost. You can find out more about us, browse all the episodes, and view the show notes at startupification.fm. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, Stephen is at DrostyBoy, I'm at Matt Ferrugia, and the show is at startup_FM. Hi everyone, it's Matt here. Stephen and I are joined this week by a special guest, Genevieve Bell, who you may remember we talked about as the instigator of the stack metaphor way back in episode 4. She is a Vice President and Senior Fellow at Intel, and distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell also established the 3A Institute at the Australian National University in Canberra in 2017 with a mission to build a new branch of engineering to manage the impact of AI on humanity. She's an anthropologist, a technologist, and a futurist, and Stephen and I have a great chat with her, covering everything from designing things that don't exist and transforming universities for the future, to the smell of books and undersea cables. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi Genevieve, how are you?
I'm good, Matt. How are you?
Good, yeah, you like that little pause before I said hi. So Stephen is somewhere in the world about to join us, but we're going to... Oh, he's here.
Back,
hi, Stephen.
Back.
How are you, Stephen? Stressed?
I'm very stressed, sorry. My Wi-Fi is not working, going up and down, so apologies for that.
Well, the good thing is that this episode of Startupification, we have a guest, so we don't have to hear your wonderful voice. It's not strictly necessary, but it would be nice, but we'll crack on without you. So we have a guest today, Genevieve Bell. We've talked about Genevieve on a previous episode about the stack, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. So Genevieve, welcome to our little podcast, and would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kind of hear about what you're doing now at 3AI.
Happily. So, hi. I am currently, I know it's nice to get to talk to you both. So I'm currently in Canberra, Australia, so a little bit in the future and a very long way away. I have one of those crazy backgrounds where if you were to try and make it into fiction, no one would believe you. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford. My area of expertise in those days was Native American studies, feminist and queer theory. I somehow managed to get from that background into Intel in true Australian fashion, because the accent should give it away. I managed that by meeting a man in a bar in Palo Alto in the late 1990s. And as you do. And one thing led to another, and I got a job. That's usually not what one thing leads to, but in this case it did.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a good outcome.
It is a good outcome, although it was a classic encounter in an American bar where what he said to me was, "What do you do?" I said I was an anthropologist. He said, "What's that?" I said, "I studied people." He said, "Why?"
That guy had all the chat, that guy.
He did. He was all over it. I was like, "Well, why do you study people?" I'm like, "Because they're interesting."
Wait, what was this person's job?
So actually really interesting. He turned out to be a lovely human being. It just took a little while for us to work that out. He was a serial entrepreneur. He was on his second or third startup at that point in the Valley. Wow. Had a series of successful startups at that point and was working on looking at next generation e-ink, if you'll believe it, because we're talking 1998. So basically conductive paper and ideas about digital printing. And so we ended up having a bit of an argument, he and I, about whether digital technologies would get rid of paper, because he was convinced that paper was going to become irrelevant. And I laughed at him and said it was a stubborn material artifact. And he said, "What does that mean?" I'm like, "Yeah, it does all this stuff. It's not just about writing things on it. Paper's used for all this other stuff, so it's not going away anytime soon." And he told me I was wrong, and we had a good argument, and I got a job.
And turned out you were right.
Yes.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Happy to report 24 years later, paper is still a stubborn material artifact.
So if you're listening, serial entrepreneur who hangs out in bars, it turns out that paper it looked threatened, but it came back in a big way. People like the smell.
That's the smell of gutta percha. That's not the smell of paper.
Well, it's the best medium for conveying that smell, turns out.
That's true. Well, because you couldn't really carry around bits of the transatlantic underground undersea cable, which is the other place that rubber first got used. So the stuff that holds books together, the reason when you go into a used bookstore, it has that incredible smell. It has to do with the binding material that's decaying. So it's basically an organic material that's in decay. And the first time that was really used at scale in the world was to wrap the copper in the undersea cable that connected Dingle in Ireland to Heart's Content in Canada.
That's amazing. So what you're saying is basically books have the same smell as the internet, because that's the cable that gives us internet over here, right?
That's true, and I particularly like that thought.
There we go. So listen, tell us a little bit more. Sorry, I got fascinated by that anecdote.
Okay. I'd never thought of it that way. I'm like, well, I do actually have a piece of the undersea cable. It was given to me when they were having their 150th, 160th anniversaries. It's never occurred to me to sniff it and go, oh, it's the internet.
There you go. That's what you can do now. Should you have a piece of that cable? I'm just wondering, is it needed? But anyway, I'm going to be quiet now, and you're going to get to tell us a bit more about yourself and about 3AI.
So, demented anthropologist, clearly, spent the 20 years that followed that episode in a bar working at Intel, so big American semiconductor company. Spent my time building next generation technologies and doing work in the kind of innovation space. My job there was to help bring insights about what people cared about, who they were, what fascinated them, to bring all of that into Intel's sort of traditional business. So I sometimes think my job was to basically haunt all the buildings with all the people who couldn't be in the building. So how do you ensure that you're bringing stories about what people care about, what frustrates them, what they want for themselves, their kids, their families, and how do you use all of that to inspire next generation technology, innovation and invention? And so I did that for the better part of 22 years now. And about 3 years ago, I came back to Australia, where I was born, to start a new program here at the Australian National University. And that program has a devastatingly simple and possibly greatly overly ambitious agenda, which is to build a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, responsibly, and sustainably to scale. Because for me, one of the things that, I know, small task, just a little, and then I'll have a cup of tea and maybe a lie down. The kind of the notion there for me was that I was looking around the valley and I was really struck by the ways in which people were talking about AI and talking about the places it was going to go and the things it was being used for. And I was really struck by the fact that it was obviously not just a new technology, but a new form of infrastructure. And that it was going to get to scale the way, well, steam engines had become railways and light bulbs had become electrical grids and the mainframe had become computing. And I sort of thought to myself, well, all of those previous industrial revolutions and previous ways of kind of changing the world required people to do that work. So, you know, civil engineers and electrical engineers and computer scientists. And I kept looking around and thinking, who are the people that are going to do that work now? And I just didn't see it anywhere. And so I said to the head of the university here, I think I want to build a new branch of engineering. And he went, okay. I was like, all right then. Take a deep breath and go, how do you build a branch of engineering in the 21st century? And so I decided it was about three things. You had to theorize it into existence, so work out what's the kind of the underlying story of that new branch of engineering. I think you should probably go study it into existence, so go look at who are the people that are already encountering those systems and what are the challenges they're facing and how would you want to engage with that and what might you learn from it. And then I thought you should try teaching it into existence, so start an experimental program and see where that gets us. And so 2.5, nearly 3 years into that process, we have bits of all of those things. We've had an experimental education program running for 2+ years now. So we've had 2 cohorts of master's students. We've just started our first PhD program. We're recruiting for our 3rd cohort of students. It's kind of crazy. Working out how do you teach a thing that doesn't quite exist yet. We've been working with a bunch of different organizations who have pieces of the puzzle. They're building some kind of system that's got AI in its core. And it's a pretty diverse group of people. And then we're trying to work out what are the basic questions and underlying tenets of this new branch of engineering. So, you know, I sometimes say I'm running a startup inside a university. I think key lesson number 1 there is don't. Key lesson number 2 is if you're going to, just keep doing it.
Yeah, just fight the machine.
Yeah, basically.
So what's the challenges of, that's totally fascinating. What are the challenges of running a startup inside a university? I mean, it seems obvious. I could guess, but you're actually living it.
Listen, there's a couple of them that are, so some of them are the things you'd expect because they're often startup challenges. I think one of the things for me about startups is you're always on a different timescale than everyone else around you. You have both this sense of incredible urgency and a particular kind of relationship to patience. Like you both got to do it now, but you're also committed to an idea well past the point anyone else is committed to it. And I think for me, the timescale thing's been an interesting challenge at the university. when I first got here, one of my colleagues, who'd later become a friend, said to me, I think you're going to have a problem with time. I'm like, what does that mean? He's like, well, at the university, short term is the next year, medium term is 3 to 5 years, and long term is 10. I'd come out of, a big tech company, so I just looked at him with, I'm sure, horror on my face. And I said, well, what's urgent? And he's like, well, clearly very little. Okay.
Exactly.
It's like, all right. So where I come from, short term is the next quarter or maybe 2, medium term is 12 to 18 months, and long term is a fantasy someone else gets to have, and everything else is urgent. And he just laughed. And so I think for me, one of the real challenges has been that time scale. So I want to move faster, and I think of time as being in smaller increments. So that's been a really interesting challenge of how you negotiate that. I think a little bit about, there's a whole series of processes that have developed over decades to make things work, but they're designed to reproduce the things that already exist. And so they're perennially hostile to things that don't look like the things that already exist. And that's always an interesting challenge, right? You can either try and make yourself seem legible. So one of my favorite anthropologists talks about this notion of how do you get seen by structures. So you have to be legible to them, right? So you have to make yourself look like something they recognize. So how do you have pieces that they understand? The other alternative is, of course, to just do nothing they recognize and they don't pay any attention. So you kind of skate by, like you're in a cloak of invisibility by just not doing anything they recognize. But you've got to, I suspect, do a bit of both. So I think the biggest things would be that they just have a completely different idea of time than I do, and a very different kind of relationship to stability versus change.
Yeah, it's exactly the analogy to startups versus incumbents, right? Yeah. Is that what you're going to jump in, Stephen? Oh, sorry, I talked across you. On you go.
Yeah, no. Jenna, hearing that response from you there, it makes me think of exactly what Matt was just about to bring up, I guess. The whole idea that what you're doing almost seems like sort of corporate transformation, but for the university space. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. So, I find myself encountering many of the things I recognize from my friends who run startups and from my own experience of running new organizations inside big organizations, is that you're always running up against both a sense of you suggesting doing it another way feels like you are challenging the things that people value, and it feels like it's a threat rather than saying this is just a different opportunity. It's not a zero-sum game. There are multiple ways we can enact this, so let's find some other kind of language to talk about it. So there's that piece. I think one of the pieces that is often true when you're running a startup is you have such a clear view about the end state, and not everyone else sees it that way, and so it becomes a really interesting, I think, constant negotiation of how do you communicate this world is coming to people who are looking at you going, I do not know what you were talking about. And so there's a little bit of kind of how do you give people a sense of the world you see. And so for me in a university, because I've spent so much time somewhere else, my kind of view of the landscape and of the competition is completely different. And so there's a little bit of how do you make that intelligible to the people that you're talking to, and it requires sometimes a degree of patience.
Do you find that it's helpful to bring along allies? And this might, the word allies kind of, there's a lot of heavy usage these days, but do you think that, so for example, having corporate partners to show the university, I'm trying to map a bunch of my experience, I guess, with corporate transformation language. And part of it's creating that new language, but part also maybe bringing some partners? Absolutely.
And for two reasons, right? One is that I sometimes think one of the hardest things about being someone who can see a different future is that it's really lonely, right? If you're the only person who sees it, it's an incredibly lonely business to be someone who's seen a different future and to try and bring people along on that. And having other people who see that future too makes it, I think, a little less alienating for you as a founder or as a startup person. I also think sometimes it's easier for people to hear a vision from someone else. We used to joke about this a lot at Intel, that, sometimes it was easier for people at Intel to hear about research, social science, and user experience and design from someone who wasn't us. So we used to bring in people from somewhere else and they go, well, you have that right here. And it was always easier to hear it from somewhere else. So for me, the idea of having other people on the journey with you, they tend to form lots of different pieces of the puzzle though, right? There's some people who are allies and partners. There are some people who can be advocates and sponsors. Sometimes it's good to have people who are willing to have your back, but also be willing to ask you a couple of hard questions along the way, but are doing it from a position of wanting you to be successful.
Yeah.
One thing that do you see part of your mission is to almost create a kind of an army of many Genevieves, because I've heard you talk about the kind of the Bell Labs diaspora flowing to Intel and HP, and the equivalent we have today is like the PayPal mafia and the people coming out of the Stripe investment vehicle. What do you want from your your 3 cohorts, your 30 cohorts? What do you want those people to go out into the world and to evangelize for you?
Oh gosh, that's a terrifying prospect. I don't think anyone in the world wants an army of Genevieves. I think that's a vision. That is not a vision splendid. Listen, I know it sounds crazy, but I really am deeply committed to the proposition that what we're actually doing here is building a new branch of engineering. And so what I imagine I'm creating is the next cohort of engineers, right? Whether we call them cybernetic engineers or systems and design engineers, it's sort of the same way I look back at the Ecole Polytechnique or Imperial or any of those places that built civil engineering 100, 200, 300 years ago. It's that, right? I imagine that what I'm creating is a set of people who will hold lots of different roles and be in lots of different places in the conversation. Because it isn't just about being builders, it's about being regulators, it's about the people who are going to imagine the systems and design the systems, but also regulate them and run them and secure them and even decommission them on the other end of the pipeline, right? And so for me, it's funny, you're the second person today to ask me what I want in 30 generations' time. In this case, that's only 30 years, to be clear. And I think what I'd hope we would have done was created a different vocabulary for talking about all these technical systems and created a whole series of people who knew how to build those systems in a way that was sustainable and responsible and safe, much the same way, civil engineers of 200 years ago knew how to build railway systems that were safe and reliable. It's sort of that kind of transformation I'm hoping for. So if I imagine it's evangelizing, I think was the word you used, there's some mission that they're on, right? For me, it's about being really clear about the idea of getting past that kind of language of what's the problem we need to solve to being able to think through what are the questions we need to ask here. Because I frequently think the problem someone's being assigning you isn't the right one. So how do you get better at asking questions? How do you get better at taking a step back and working out where the edges of the system really are? And how do you do a much better job of asking the kind of critical questions we should ask before we build things rather than just building them? Because I'm so acutely aware that with AI in particular, that notion of build it and they will come or build it in beta and throw out into the world feels slightly more dangerous than it ever has.
Jen, Matt and I sort of talk about the term engineer quite a lot. And Matt tends to say engineer. I tend to say developer very often, and there's some kind of semantic kind of argument we tacitly always have around that. In prep for this conversation, I was looking at the etymology of the word engineer, and it seems that it comes from genius, from basically having some kind of secret. So it's very much in the world of someone building a clock tower that's beautiful and mechanical and amazing, and once they've finished, the person who commissioned it sort of puts out the eyes of the builder, and it's all about keeping things under wraps and keeping things secret and creating a kind of elite that doesn't allow other people into that kind of world of understanding how something came about. For us, with Startupification, we called the podcast that because we wanted to expose the kinds of conversations that people have that are kind of secret to everyone, I guess. And or as many people as possible who are interested in it. And it strikes me that 3AI seems to be similar in that sense. There seems to be a kind of underlying mission to bring more diversity into that conversation and take it away purely just from a sort of Silicon Valley kind of vocabulary as well. I think very much all of this is just sort of speaking a kind of language. Is that something that you think about? Is that important to you, or am I misinterpreting?
No, you're absolutely right, possibly with two notable exceptions. One is that the history of engineering that I find really interesting. So the history of the word, right, it comes from the word ingenuity, so like, invention, basically, not engines. Some people think that it's engineering. It's like, no, it's from a very different root word. For me, what's fascinating about the very first engineers, so the first people to call themselves engineers, it comes out in the middle of the French Revolution. So French Revolution happens, the revolutionary, sort of middle government suddenly realizes that the act of the French Revolution, which profoundly decentered monarchy and the priesthood, had profoundly decentered monarchy and the priesthood. And the problem with that was that monarchy and the priesthood had created stability, and it ensured bridges and roads and systems whereby goods and services moved around. And so in that intervening period in the 1780s and 1790s, part of what the government that would ultimately come into being in France realized was that they needed to create a class of people that got there by dint of their intellect and their work, not by birth, and that those people were going to have to build the nation. And that in building a nation where there hadn't been one before, there had been a kingdom, meant you had to create a series of resources that were in some ways open and transparent, and things could move freely amongst them. And they realized they were going to need to create people to do that for them, because up until then it had been basically the landed gentry. And so they create this experimental educational curriculum at the École Polytechnique. And they pull together what in those days would have been natural philosophy, so geology, chemistry, physics, maths. They pulled in a little bit of literature, engineering, religion, cartography, and calligraphy, a little bit of surveying. And they created a generation of people who would go on to make bridges and roads. And those people were engineers. And that first cohort of engineers that came out of the École Polytechnique were effectively radicals, right? The proposition here was that you were going to be able to build a nation, and that nation would be founded on a series of lines that were unimaginable if you lived inside a kingdom up until that point, right? So for me, there's something really interesting in the notion of what it meant to be an engineer was actually quite a radical proposition. And its traditions inside the United Kingdom, and particularly Scotland versus England, is really interesting that way. And so for me, part of it is I actually think of what we're doing at the 3A Institute as being a similarly radical proposition. We want to build something different than what has been before. And for me, I know the best way to do that in the 21st century is to ensure the most diverse collection of voices and lived experiences and backgrounds you can get. So at this point, the staff of the Institute has an award-winning photojournalist, a nuclear physicist, someone who's got a background in fine art, other people who have backgrounds in systems engineering and anthropology and biomedicine. My students have come from as diverse places as physics, maths, astronomy, law, public policy, theatre, fine arts, architecture, economics, computer science. They've been civil servants, they've been in the military, they've been running their own companies, they've worked inside big companies. It's been this incredibly diverse collection. Oh, and they've ranged in age from 25 to 60. And they've come from all over the world. And that was hugely important to me, right? Now, I think one of the things any of us who ever run any organization knows is the more diverse it gets, the higher the conflict. And so one of the really interesting challenges I think you have if you want to manage organizations, even little ones that have lots of different voices, and I always think the lots of different voices is incredibly helpful to getting to more creative and interesting ideas. You also have to have a slightly higher tolerance for people not understanding each other at the first pass. Because when everyone's alike, we all have a shorthand, right? We know how to talk to each other, but it also means we don't hear other things. And so creating room to have all that kind of noise and difference means as a leader or a manager, you have to get a little bit more comfortable with not everyone being like you and helping everyone else live in that space too, to sort of, tarry in the ambiguity, right? And I think that's a really interesting challenge about how you do something as radical as we're doing is you have to have this moment where everyone's kind of irritated and you have to let that go on for a bit because that's part and parcel of how you get to a different space. But yeah, that's a very long-winded answer, Stephen. What I could have just said was yes. Yes, I agree.
No, this is these are my favorite conversations. I can't even express it. And actually, do you know what? If it's okay, you've just triggered a thought in my head, and this could be totally wrong, but it might be an interesting avenue. I hope. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't the French economy back then, at that time, roughly the sort of physiocrats? And didn't the physiocrats kind of believe that the country was kind of like a body?
What are you talking about, Stephen?
No, so Stephen's not wrong about this because, in fact, Stephen, the other thing you need to know that was part of that entire conversation is Voltaire. And so one of Voltaire's obsession with electricity in that period was that he believed
Yeah.
that electricity would be the lifeblood of the revolution, because unlike the blood of the aristocrats, it was effectively pure and
Yeah.
manufactured,
Yes.
and so it wasn't sort of riddled with human biases, which is one of the first examples I know of this kind of fetish of the technical
Yes.
being somehow absent the human, although it was obviously being made by humans. But yeah, Voltaire used to talk about electricity as the lifeblood of the revolution.
Well, I was just thinking the interesting thing for me right now in my head is that it strikes me what you're building and where you're building it in Australia. Maybe we should talk about place a little bit more. Is almost like a kind of new kind. Oh, I hate to say new normal. Jen, I used to say new normal all the time, and then COVID struck, and now it sounds ridiculous to say new normal. So apologies. But it's like a new way of stating what that. Looking for it's the search for a new metaphor, like the physiocrats almost. Like, what is a new body? What is the new definition of a community or the world? And it strikes me that maybe what you're building, there's an overriding narrative at the moment that the Chinese are building a certain flavor of AI and Americans are building a flavor of AI and Europe needs to find their voice and what's going to happen to the UK post Brexit. But you seem to be saying, no, there's a place in Australia where all these people from all over the world, from all different ages, can come and look. It'd be really interesting to see like how much you're looking back to history to look to how to take bits that were good somehow and then double down on those to build a future outward looking, future looking kind of thing. Sorry.
No, that's it's a lovely question, and it's a lovely provocation, Stephen. It makes me think of a couple of different things, right? It makes me think of Yeats and the notion that the center won't hold, which is a piece of verse I keep coming back to, right? From Ireland after the Easter Rising. I mean, I keep coming back to that notion of what it means to have a center and what it means not to, and just how sort of startling and striking that is at this moment in time. Because you're right, in the middle of a pandemic, it's hard to know how the world will unfold again. I'm also acutely aware that whenever I talk, I look back in history, not I think because it gives us answers, but it helps me frame better questions. And when I think about the kind of earlier moments of computing in particular and AI, I keep being drawn back to a moment before AI in the 1940s and 1950s, when a collection of very diverse voices kept gathering in New York under the banner of the Macy's conferences around cybernetics, and when they were trying to work out what the future of computing would be. And they were pretty convinced back then that you couldn't talk about the future of computing without imagining it was part of this much bigger system, right? And that system should include technology, humans, and the ecological world. And for me, there's something about that set of pieces that feels really important. And then the question about place, it's always where I start, right? So truthfully, I would have started this conversation under ordinary circumstances where I might just sort of park it for a minute and do the thing that I should have done when we began, which is to acknowledge that I'm sitting today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and to acknowledge that I'm on country that was never ceded and always sacred, and to pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders of whoever country you are sitting on now where you are hearing this. Because for me, the notion of where you are is hugely important, and place is incredibly relevant to how things get built and why they get built. And for me, the fact that I get to be in a place that has been continuously inhabited for at least 60,000 years, where some of the oldest technical systems that we know on the planet still live. UNESCO just certified one of them down in the state of Victoria. It's the first World Heritage Site of a human technical system, so it's an eel aqua centre that's 6,500 years old. But there's another one north of me that was built 40,000 years ago that's a set of fish weirs that, 40,000 years old, last used in about 1915. And, imagine a technical system that long. Like, you can aspire to 10 years usually, but a thing that's 40,000, for me, sort of reminds me that where you start matters too, and how you know the place you're in and what it tells you, and what its history is, runs through who you are and what you do and the places in which things are possible, right? And sort of all of that history accretes. You can't talk about engines without talking about James Watt in Glasgow. or without talking about the rocket and the Rainhill trials. And, you know, history is in particular places, right? It's not an abstracted conversation. It's particular people in particular places in particular moments of time with very particular biographies. And for me, that specificity is sometimes really important, because it's easy to get lost in the abstract, but the particulars, well, they matter to me.
Can I jump in, Genevieve, with something that, I really enjoy hearing that. That's amazing. You know, fishing traps 40,000 years old. That's just incredible. I enjoy hearing that. But can I put a challenge to you, which I think is very particular to our location in Scotland, just as a little bit of background. You talked a little, it sounds like you're a bit like you're talking about, you know, in the early days this subject was much more diverse, and it's become less diverse in its thinking, at least intellectually, and one of your missions is to reverse that, right? So what we see, what we reflect being in Scotland rather than being in Silicon Valley, is we're always kind of looking at Silicon Valley like that's the way to do it. It's this kind of like weird mimesis moment where we expect to do exactly, we're trying to be a mini version of them. So that's challenge number one. And challenge number two for us is we do look back in Scotland. It's a trait in Scotland where we say, weren't we amazing, you know, 150 years ago? We were kind of like, we created all these things, you know, there's a story about Scotland about we invented all this stuff. And it's not, how, you know, I worry that that's not really helping us reinvent ourselves for the future. So my question is, we're caught between not mimicking what's happening in Silicon Valley and not just trying to sit and become like some sort of Victorian era Scots. How should we move forward like that? Because it's really important to me, just as it's important to you that Australia is part of the future. It's important to me and Stephen too that Scotland's part of the future. But how should we think of not getting bogged down and just trying to mimic the past or mimic America?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. Listen, I think one of the things that's really interesting for me, at least, being here in Australia, is when I talk publicly, I often talk about those fish traps. And I don't talk about them as a way of saying history is preserved in amber and that's what we should be looking back to, but more as a way of saying, I'm sitting in a place that's been building the future for 40,000 years. That gives me a huge responsibility to keep building the future. Like, I shouldn't get to sit on those fish traps and think, well, we're done. What it should say to me is, anything is possible, and here are things that surround me that were already done that should encourage me to think it is possible, give me a legacy that says there are these things that really mattered, but also a responsibility to keep talking about building new futures, right? So for me, that history is a touchstone, but not a millstone, if that makes sense. Like it's a way of kind of saying, yeah, there's this history and we should absolutely celebrate it. And there are extraordinary pieces of what that history tells us about how the current world is. And we shouldn't forget those connections because they're meaningful and real. By the same token, I think you're right, like living perennially looking backwards is not a good way to do things either. I think one of the most interesting things for me about having spent time in Silicon Valley is how seductive it is as a myth-making place. Like, it can tell its own myth in real time and change all the details. It's miraculous to be around it. You're like, wow, I was in that meeting and that's not what, oh, okay. That's what happened. Yeah. Fascinating. The things I think I learnt out of that matter to me and that are pieces that I've brought into my practice now have less to do with the notion of trying to mimic the place, because, gosh, it's a complicated place. It's a place that constantly erases itself rather than celebrates itself. You know, in the time I was there, I watched orchards disappear. I watched the concert huts and Nissan huts disappear. I watched the whole history of it being the Air Force money and early technology get erased by, you know, the next generation of people, and the names on the buildings all changed and the stories all changed. I think, you know, the pieces about it that were incredibly valuable, though, were this incredible willingness to engage in that reinvention. I can be critical of it, but the most remarkable thing about it is its kind of capacity to say, it's okay to have done that thing, now let's do the next thing. And to be a little bit liberated from the pull and the pull of the past is sort of an amazing thing. The other piece, which no one ever really talks about, but which is totally true, is that for every single one of those hero stories that get told about the Valley, about some, you know, single inventor and a really good idea, there are always 20 people in the room. And it's actually a place where there's an incredible amount of willingness to help and build things collectively. And so for me, there are some really nice lessons that come out of that. But it's also the case that some of the most complicated things that have come out of there are when people have tried to imagine that they could solve a problem for everyone on the planet without being aware that what it's like to be in Glasgow or Edinburgh is completely different than what it's like to be in Palo Alto or San Jose. And that solving a problem for Palo Alto may not solve it for Sterling.
Nice local knowledge there.
Yeah, nice. I'm impressed. That's what having a Glaswegian dad does for you, isn't it?
Well, I am an anthropologist and I have done fieldwork in Scotland.
There you go.
It's been a while, though.
We talk about the metaphor of a playbook very often, and it goes into what Matt was just raising with mimesis, I guess. We talk about how we try to expose people to playbooks here under the kind of conceit that entrepreneurship or startup thinking, whatever you want to call it, is somehow teachable, and we put bits together. Doing that, we think very hard about the ontology of what those bits are. I wondered if you're comfortable talking about it. What are the sort of ontology lessons you've learned now with 3AI? What are the sort of building blocks you're looking at internally to bring about this new generation of engineers?
Oh, it's a good question. So for me, you talk about mimesis, and that makes me think of Taussig. I want to talk about, James Scott and the notions of legibility and visibility. So for me, It really has been about how do you make things that people can recognize as well as things that people absolutely can't. And so when I look at so I think in some ways that the Institute's a portfolio, right? We've had a portfolio of activities over the last 3 years that all build towards a branch of engineering. But I was acutely aware I needed some things in that portfolio that made sense to the university. So start a master's program because they understood that. Now, of course, do it in a way no one had ever seen before. So recruit your students off the internet. What? Set every discipline as a cognate field. What? Give scholarships to ensure that you get a diversity of people, and then only take, we took about 10% of that first applicant pool. And that was all considered to be very strange. They understood the master's thing, kind of, but then everything we did after that was just demented. And so I think for me, it was that balance of do things that they recognized, but then seriously pervert it under the hood. So part of my strategy is that you do things that make sense in the context, but push every edge as to what that would look like.
Would you bring queer theory into that thinking?
Oh, absolutely. I am, that would be part of the good kind of feminist kind of critique of both how you get out of normative notions about what does a degree look like, how do you think about education. So whilst I have a master's and a PhD program, I also have a series of short courses, and I keep having to explain to them non-macro credentials. That makes them crazy. I've started to use marked categories. I'm like, let me tell you about your macro credentials. They're like, what? I'm like, well, if you're going to have micro credentials, we have macro credentials. They're like, ah. So yeah, there's part of it of how do you find a little bit of play in the system. But yeah, I mean, how do you take what is the obvious stuff, do that, but then push it much further past the places that it would usually go? That also means how do you confound people's expectations about stuff? So when we started to develop a portfolio of partner organizations and people we wanted to go work with, so people who were building next generation AI systems, it was all around at the usual suspects, right? You'd of course go think about how do you work with people who are building autonomous vehicles and, people who are building next generation autonomous systems, sure. I also said I want to work with an arts organization because I know people are doing really interesting things in the arts with this technology. And yeah, it's not about productivities and efficiencies, but what's the Royal Shakespeare Company doing with AR and VR? What's the Queensland Ballet doing with drones? And how do we make sure that also informs our practice? So part of it was, again, about how do you take the things people expect and then push them a whole lot further? And then I think the same would be true when
exciting.
Yeah, it's been kind of fun. It also means that
it's mind blowing. Jen, sorry to jump in. Just it's burning on my head just because literally what you're just saying. Credentialing. Do you give people like scores or grades, or do you just is there a different way of doing that?
Well, so the university has some protocols about that. So if you're going to have a macro credential, in this case a master's program, there are a series of government schemes that certify the courses. There's the AQF framework, the Australian Quality Framework, so the higher education framework. There's one around a taxonomy of learning outcomes that you need to use. So we have all of those. But, inside of that, we have certainly, I think, for a School of Engineering, changed the way the number of things are done. I'm fairly certain I still have the only lab on campus that has both a sewing machine and a 3D printer. As you do. And I'm almost certain I'm the only person on the campus to be teaching critical theory with Lego and Play-Doh.
There's definitely a thing happening right now, partly COVID related, partly because the world is changing and COVID is maybe just an accelerant to that. People are talking about whether the credentialing role of higher education institutes, is that all there is? Is there more? And just one data point that's come out really recently, 20% of Harvard's incoming freshmen have deferred because they're not willing to take the virtual experience. Is there a sense that it will all have to be reinvented and things like you're doing will be the vanguard in that, or is this just a moment of temporal change and it'll slip back to the way things were?
Oh gosh, Matt, there's a question that I suspect every university administrator is
exactly
grappling with, as well as some tertiary, as well as some primary and secondary school ones too. We've been really lucky. We took our students remote and did remote delivery for the second half of last semester. We're actually back in the classroom this semester. We've had a very different COVID experience, I think, than many other places in the world. So our students are back in our classrooms at the moment, masked and socially distant, but back together. I think one of the things that remains really important to me as an educator, and I think as someone who thinks about human stuff, is that I always think that education is important both as an individual experience and a collective one. And so one of the things I often find really confounding about online education and the notion of a personalized learning journey is we forget in those kind of experiences that most of what you learned at university, you learned from the people around you, not just you. And so how you think about building out a cohort's really important. That said, we have found all kinds of ways to experiment with the various digital platforms at our disposal and worked out how to blend physical, virtual, remote, digital, physical stuff in hand in order to deliver some kind of experience. But I also think there's this incredible responsibility for universities to stop thinking that the only education they deliver is in a credentialed program. So for me, it's been about how do we make sure we have a credentialed program, because I recognize that as a legibility exercise, but how do I also make sure that we are creating short courses, or micro-credentials, or just frankly other educational experiences that bring other people along with us. So, we've been using Karel Čapek's play, so the very first play about robots, called Rossum's Universal Robot, the play that coins the word in 1921. It's just it's having its 100th birthday, and so we decided we should basically do an adaptation of that play and use it as a way to teach about AI and ethics, because there had to be a better way into that conversation. So we've built an educational experience that uses a play, a digital scavenger hunt, as a way of getting people to think about ethics and AI. And so for me, all of that stuff of how do you take all the incredibly smart stuff that's in universities and pull it out and make it accessible to people that otherwise physically couldn't be there, who, in terms of time constraints, couldn't be there, who don't want a degree, but they do want to have a moment where their heads get to kind of open and new things get stuffed in there. That feels like a good thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that I keep on thinking of the word playfulness. That playfulness when it comes to early things that are still struggling to articulate what they exactly are. It seems to be so important and maybe even undervalued by most universities, to be honest. It seems like the more something can articulate what it is, the more the structure seems to be almost punitive. So you can start to grade people very clearly or give them penalties if they miss X, Y, Z. You can define something so well that you even define what's a miss, versus if something's so early stage, the playfulness seems to be so important. Again, I'm thinking of like a corporate transformation metaphor. It seems so simple. It's an exciting, super dynamic place, and thank you for adding those examples of theatre, etc. So that ontology is really broad, right? Really massive in that case.
Oh, absolutely. So for me, I think there has to be a role for all the human stuff, right? We sometimes talk, and it sounds so corny, but we talk about the fact that our curriculum is about heads and hands, but also hearts, right? Like if you're not bringing someone's whole self along, for me, it sort of feels like a missed opportunity, and everyone does that differently, right? What that feels like for every individual is going to be a different lived experience. But no, I firmly believe if there's not a bit of laughter in my classrooms, if there isn't a moment of just pure silliness, if there aren't moments where you have an experience that reduces you to tears or wonderment, or that pushes your head so hard you actually have to go and take a time out, I think all of those things should be possible, right? And that means you have to be willing to imagine that there are lots of different ways to engage. And so trying to create the room for that, yeah, that's always an interesting adventure.
Because, I mean, ultimately, you're kind of saying, it's almost like you're going back to a deeper level meaning of what that institution, what education should be about. You know, it's about a whole person journey and in aid of inventing the future, rather than just a kind of pipeline for the jobs that we currently have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, someone's got to do it. So thankfully you are.
Yes. What better than an anthropologist lurking inside a school of, a College of Engineering and Computer Science?
Yeah, no, for me, it's just so clear that the coming up with the stack metaphor, of course that person would be front and center of this. So it's I could talk forever about this. Jen, I think we'll probably bring it to a halt now. Thanks so much for your time. This was so kind of you.
You're most welcome.
And it was just an honour to talk to you. So,
well, listen,
thank you very much.
Here's my only request. If amongst your listening cohort there is someone who thinks, I really need to get out of Scotland and go to Australia, or someone who thinks, that sounds like a conversation I want to be part of, will you make sure they track me down? You can find us on the interwebs, pretty obviously. 3ainstitute.org. You can find me on Twitter under Feral Data, because that's where I would be. And seriously, it's the thing that I'm really clear about, right? We may tell the story of the lone startup hero, but the reality is it's never a single person's journey, and I don't want to do this by myself. So I need help. So if there's people out there who think, yes, you do need help, and I want to be that person, you track us down, because we are up for all the voices and all the engagement we can get.
Brilliant, absolutely. If you want to invent the future, then hit up Genevieve on Twitter and apply for the course. Fantastic. Listen, we really appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you.
It's absolutely
and I think
my pleasure.
we'll draw it to a close. We'll draw it to a close there. Thanks a lot. See you later, Stephen.
Thanks. Bye, Jen.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Startupification. If you have any feedback, you can contact us at startupification.fm/feedback. And if you want to support the show, please consider writing us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a small thing you can do, but it really helps other people find the show. Special thanks to Ollie Littlejohn, who edited and produced today's episode, and to Stephen Coleman, who wrote and performed our music.